The alarm shrieked through the corridors of the Meridian, a sound that turned Nadia Reeves's blood to ice. She gripped the edge of her workstation in the botanical lab, watching in horror as specimen containers tumbled from their shelves, scattering seeds and soil across the floor. The ship lurched violently to one side, and she barely caught herself before slamming into the wall. All hands braced for impact. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, barely audible over the screaming of stressed metal and failing systems. "We're going down." Nadia's fingers flew across her tablet, desperately trying to seal the atmospheric containment units. Years of research, rare specimens from a dozen worlds, all of it, would be lost if she couldn't secure the lab. But the ship pitched again, harder this time, and she felt the sickening sensation of freefall. She abandoned her station and threw herself into the emergency pod built into the wall, yanking the harness across her chest. Through the small viewport, she caught a glimpse of the planet rushing up to meet them, a world of russet stone and purple-tinged sky. Beautiful and utterly alien. The impact came a heartbeat later. The world went black. When consciousness returned, it came with pain. Nadia groaned, her head pounding, her ribs aching with each shallow breath. The emergency pod had deployed its shock absorption gel, which now oozed around her like translucent jelly. She fumbled with the release mechanism, her fingers clumsy and uncoordinated. The pod hissed open, and she tumbled out onto scorched earth. The air hit her lungs thin, but breathable. That was something. Around her, the Meridian lay in pieces, its hull torn open like paper. Debris scattered across a landscape of red rock and scrubby vegetation. Smoke rose from a dozen fires, and the acrid smell of burning circuitry stung her nostrils. "Hello?" Nadia called out, her voice hoarse. "Anyone? Can anyone hear me?" Silence answered her, broken only by the groan of settling metal and the whistle of wind through the wreckage. She staggered to her feet, pressing a hand to her side where her ribs screamed in protest. A quick self-assessment revealed bruises, cuts, and a possible cracked rib, but nothing immediately life-threatening. She had to find survivors. Had to find anyone. Nadia picked her way through the debris field, calling out names, checking every intact pod she could find. Most were empty, their occupants either thrown clear or... She didn't want to think about the alternative. The main cabin was a twisted ruin, completely inaccessible. The bridge section had sheared off entirely. Buried somewhere in a canyon she could see in the distance, it was at the engineering section. The least damaged part of the ship, that she heard it a sound that was almost musical. A series of tones that rose and fell in what might have been words. Nadia's heart leaped. Someone else had survived. She rounded a collapsed bulkhead and froze. The being struggling to free itself from the wreckage was decidedly not human. Tall and slender, with skin that seemed to shimmer between blue and green depending on the angle of the light, it moved with an otherworldly grace, even while injured. Bioluminescent patterns traced along its arms and the sides of its elongated neck. Pulsing in rhythm with what Nadia assumed was breathing, its face was humanoid enough to be expressive: high cheekbones, a narrow nose, eyes that glowed with an inner amber light, but distinctly alien. Corin, the ship's engineer. She'd seen him in passing during the voyage, but had never spoken to him directly. The Valari turned at her approach, those luminous eyes widening. His markings flared bright, then dimmed to fear response, Nadia remembered from the briefing materials. They regarded each other across the wreckage to beings from different worlds, each uncertain of the other. "You're hurt," Nadia said finally, noting the way he favored his left leg, the darker fluid blood. She assumed staining his uniform. Corin's mouth moved, producing those musical tones again. When Nadia didn't respond, frustration flickered across his features. He tapped his throat, then his ear, shaking his head. The universal translator. Either his was damaged or hers was. Nadia touched her own ear and felt the crushed remains of her translator unit. Of course, that would have been too easy. They stood there for a long moment, the barrier of language yawning between them. Then Corin gestured to himself, touching his chest. "Corin," he said carefully, the word heavily accented, but recognizable. "Nadia," she replied, mimicking his gesture. Something that might have been a smile crossed his features. He pointed to his leg, then to her side, where she still pressed her hand against her ribs. His meaning was clear enough. They were both injured and in need of help. Nadia nodded slowly. Like it or not, they were in this together. Over the next hours, they worked in awkward tandem to salvage what they could from the wreckage. Corin's engineering knowledge proved invaluable. He managed to extract a functioning power cell from the ship's emergency systems, along with several survival packs that had remained intact. Nadia focused on gathering anything that could provide food or medical supplies. Her botanical training helping her identify which sealed containers were most critical communication happened through gestures. Simple words and the occasional moment of shared understanding that transcended language. When Corin found the body of the captain, Nadia saw the bioluminescent marks on his skin dim to almost nothing, a grief so profound it needed no translation. When she discovered the crushed remains of her laboratory and years of research, he stood beside her in silent acknowledgement. By the time the sun, smaller and redder than Earth, began to set, they had established a basic camp in the least damaged section of the engineering bay. Corin had rigged a shelter using salvaged hull plating and emergency blankets. Nadia had inventoried their supplies. Enough concentrated rations for perhaps 2 weeks. Water recycling equipment that might last longer if they could find a natural source. And medical supplies sufficient for basic first aid. It wasn't much. But it was survival. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped rapidly. Nadia huddled in her corner of the shelter, shivering despite the thermal blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Across from her, Corin sat with his back against the wall, his bioluminescent markings providing the only light in their makeshift home. They pulsed slowly, rhythmically, almost like a heartbeat. She found herself watching those patterns, wondering what they meant. Was the slow pulse a sign of calm or exhaustion? Did the occasional bright flare indicate thought or pain? There was a person behind those alien features, someone who had probably had a life, family, dreams. Someone who was now stranded on this desolate rock with only her for company. Corin's eyes met hers across the darkness. For a moment, Nadia felt a flash of fear, primal, instinctive, the human brain recognizing something other. But then he did something unexpected. He reached into one of the salvaged packs and pulled out 2 ration bars. He examined them both, selected one, and offered the other to her. It was a simple gesture, a kindness, a recognition of shared need. Nadia took the bar, their fingers brushing for just a moment. His skin was cool to the touch, smooth, nothing like human skin. The contact sent an odd tingle up her arm, probably just static from the dry air. "Thank you," she said softly. Corin tilted his head, those amber eyes reflecting the light of his own markings. "Thank you," he repeated slowly, testing the unfamiliar sounds. They ate in silence. 2 survivors in the vast darkness of an alien world, beginning the first fragile steps of an alliance born from necessity. Neither could have known then how that alliance would evolve. How forced proximity would break down walls. How survival would demand not just cooperation, but trust. Neither could have imagined where this journey would lead. But for now, in this moment, they had shelter. They had supplies. They had each other. And on this harsh, unforgiving planet, that would have to be enough. Morning light filtered through the gaps in their makeshift shelter, painting everything in shades of crimson and gold. Nadia woke to the sound of movement and sat up quickly, wincing as her bruised ribs protested. Corin was already awake, crouched near the entrance. Working on something she couldn't quite see, he turned at her movement, his bioluminescent markings brightening slightly. In the daylight, she could see more details, the intricate patterns that traced along his jawline, the way his skin seemed to catch and refract the light like an opal. He held up a small device, something he'd clearly salvaged and repaired during the night. "Water," he said in that careful, accented way. He pointed to a readout on the device's screen. "Finder, a water detector." Nadia felt a surge of relief. Their recycled water would only last so long. Finding a natural source was critical. She nodded eagerly, pushing herself to her feet despite the pain. "Yes. Good. We need to go now. Corin stood as well, towering over her by nearly a foot. He gestured to the supply pack, then to his leg. The makeshift bandage he'd applied yesterday was stained dark, but he moved with only a slight limp. Valerie physiology, Nadia remembered from the crew briefings, healed faster than human. Another advantage in this harsh environment, they set out together. Corin leading with the water detector while Nadia kept watch for any potential dangers. The landscape of Kepler 442 stretched before them in all directions, endless expanses of rust-colored rock formations, patches of hardy purple vegetation that seemed to grow in impossible places, and a sky that shifted between lavender and deep indigo as clouds passed overhead. It was beautiful in its own alien way, and utterly inhospitable. They walked in silence, the language barrier making conversation difficult. But Nadia found herself studying Corin, noting the efficient way he moved, how he would periodically stop to scan the horizon with those luminous eyes. His markings would flare occasionally, and she wondered if it was some kind of emotional response or simply a biological function. After nearly an hour of walking, the detector began to pulse more rapidly. Corin's markings brightened in what Nadia was beginning to recognize as excitement. He pointed ahead to a cluster of rocks, and they quickened their pace. There, nestled in a natural depression, was a pool of water. Small, perhaps only 10 feet across, but clear and fed by a thin trickle from an underground spring. Nadia knelt at the edge, pulling out the portable testing kit from her pack. She ran the analysis while Corin watched, his head tilted in that curious way of his. "Safe," she said finally, unable to contain her smile. "The water is safe." Corin's entire demeanor changed. His markings blazed bright blue-green, pulsing in rapid patterns that seemed almost joyful. He made a sound that was unmistakably laughter, higher pitched than human laughter. Musical, but laughter nonetheless. Before Nadia quite knew what was happening, he had reached down and pulled her to her feet, clasping her hands in his. The contact was electric. His cool skin against her warm palms, the strength in his long fingers. The way those amber eyes looked at her with such genuine happiness. For a moment, they were just two people celebrating a victory. Species differences forgotten. Then Nadia pulled back, suddenly aware of how close they were standing. We should fill the containers," she said, her voice slightly unsteady. Over the following days, they established a routine. Mornings were for gathering water and foraging for anything edible. Corin had an engineer's eye for spotting useful materials in the wreckage, while Nadia's botanical knowledge helped them identify which of the native plants might be digestible. They found a purple tuber that, when cooked, tasted vaguely like sweet potato. It wasn't much, but it supplemented their dwindling rations. Afternoons were spent improving their shelter, trying to repair the emergency beacon. Corin worked tirelessly on the salvaged communications equipment, his long fingers dancing over circuits and wiring with practiced ease. Nadia helped where she could, learning to hand him tools before he asked, beginning to understand the soft musical sounds that meant yes or no or careful. Evenings were for teaching each other their languages. It started simply. Nadia would point to objects, rock, water, a sky, and Corin would repeat the words, then offer the Valari equivalent. His language was melodic, full of rising and falling tones that Nadia struggled to replicate, but she tried. And when she managed a word that was close enough, his markings would pulse with what she now recognized as pleasure. "Star," Nadia said one evening, pointing up at the alien constellations beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "Star," Corin repeated. Then he added a flowing phrase in Valari, gesturing to the sky and then to his own markings. Nadia watched, fascinated, as the bioluminescent patterns on his skin shifted and changed, mimicking the twinkling of stars. "Your markings," she said slowly, touching her own arm to indicate what she meant. "They're like stars." Corin seemed to understand. He nodded, then spoke carefully in broken human standard. "Valari, we are children of stars." "Old story." "A legend," Nadia supplied. "Your people believe you came from the stars." His markings pulsed. "Yes, legend." She found herself leaning closer, drawn by the gentle light he radiated. On Earth, we tell stories about the stars, too. About how they're the souls of people who died watching over us. Corin was quiet for a moment, processing her words. Then he said something in Valari, soft and melodic. Though Nadia didn't understand the words, the tone was unmistakable grief. Loss, remembrance. Your family? She asked gently. He nodded, his markings dimming. Mother, father, sister? He touched his chest. Gone, I'm sorry. Nadia reached out without thinking, placing her hand over his. The cool smoothness of his skin was becoming familiar now, comforting rather than alien. My mother died when I was young. Illness, I understand. They sat like that for a while, hands linked, sharing a grief that transcended species. When Corin finally spoke again, his voice was soft. You. Good person, Nadia. You too, Corin. As the weeks passed, their communication improved dramatically. They developed a hybrid language of sorts, mixing human standard with Valari words, filling gaps with gestures and expressions. Nadia learned that the patterns of Corin's markings were indeed emotional indicators, bright blue for happiness, deep purple for sadness, flashing white for surprise or alarm. She also learned about Valari culture, how they valued harmony and cooperation above individual achievement, how their society was built on the principle that every person contributed something vital to the whole, how music and mathematics were considered two sides of the same coin, both fundamental to understanding the universe in turn. She shared stories of Earth, the diversity of human cultures, the conflicts and reconciliations, the constant push and pull between tradition and progress. Corin listened with rapt attention, his markings shifting through various colors as he processed information that must have seemed as alien to him as his world was to her. One afternoon, while they were reinforcing the shelter against increasingly violent windstorms, Nadia found herself laughing at Corin's attempt to whistle. The sound that came out was more like a bird trill than a human whistle, and his expression of concentration was so earnest it was endearing. You're terrible at that, she teased. His markings flashed with mock offense. You, terrible at. He made a clicking sound with his tongue that Nadia had learned was a Valari expression of amusement. I haven't tried that. Try now. Nadia attempted the clicking sound and produced something that sounded more like a hiccup. Corin's laughter rang out, musical and genuine, and she couldn't help but join in. They collapsed against the shelter wall, laughing until tears streamed down Nadia's face and Corin's markings pulsed in rapid, chaotic patterns when the laughter faded. They were sitting close together, shoulders touching. Nadia was acutely aware of the warmth building between them, the way his alien features had become not just familiar but attractive in their own way. The graceful line of his jaw, the expressiveness of those amber eyes, the living art of his bioluminescent patterns. Nadia, Corin said quietly, his voice serious now, I am glad that you survive. That we, together. Her heart did something complicated in her chest. Me too, she whispered. I can't imagine doing this alone. Or with anyone else. He turned to look at her, and the intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. His markings had shifted to a soft, warm gold color she'd never seen before. Slowly, carefully, he reached up and tucked a strand of her hair behind her ear. His cool fingers lingered against her cheek. Beautiful, he said softly, the word barely more than a breath. Nadia wasn't sure if he meant her, or the moment, or the strange connection growing between them, maybe all three. She leaned into his touch, feeling the last of her reservations crumbling away. They were from different worlds, different species, but here in this moment, none of that seemed to matter. The wind howled outside their shelter, reminding them of the harsh reality of their situation. But inside, something new was blooming, fragile and unexpected, but undeniably real. Whatever happened next, wherever this journey led them, they would face it together. And that, Nadia realized, was more than enough.